Joining me now in the studio is Ben Vogel, editor of IHS Jane's Airport Review here in London. Thanks very much, Ben, for coming to speak to us as always.
Hello.
We're going to focus today on, I guess inevitably, aviation safety and security. A lot of really big issues in the spotlight understandably, over the last few weeks, what we've seen. Perhaps MH17 still dominates. And we were talking last week about this ICAO meeting out of Montreal about strategies to cope, to try and potentially mitigate. What do we learn? Where is the industry at in the sort of the immediate aftermath? Obviously, still a lot of unanswered questions, of course, so it's rather difficult to second guess. But
that's right.
From that meeting, what have we gathered so far?
Well, the investigation is still underway. Unfortunately, it's being hampered by the actions of pro-Russian rebels around the crash site. But ICAO, as you said, had a meeting in Montreal last week, and out of that meeting came two action points. Firstly, the international aviation community is trying to set up a task force, along with other government agencies, to improve intelligence sharing with the aviation community about unsafe airspace, conflict zones, and other areas where aircraft may be put at risk. A second strand, and the other main action point coming out of the meeting, was the idea to pursue through the UN and other international legal mechanisms to regulate the deployment and use of surface-to-air weaponry. I think the first ambition is probably more realistic than the second one. In many ways, the horse has bolted as far as the surface-to-air missiles is concerned. And even intelligence sharing with the aviation sector may be tricky, given that obviously the agencies in question will want to keep certain information secret and not share it in the public domain.
Well, I mean, I was going to ask you about this because a lot of the conversations we've had here on the station over the last few weeks since this, the presumed attack on MH17, have been about exactly how fluid that situation has been, and ultimately, it's up to individual aviation authorities to control their own airspace.
That's right.
Just kind of looking back over what we've seen over the past few weeks, does it sort of freshly surprise you how much flexibility there was in how this was all regulated? Is it something that perhaps you feel maybe should have been addressed sooner?
I think so, yes. I mean, in retrospect, we can all be very wise with hindsight, and it does come as a bit of a surprise, given the fact that there have been incidents where Ukrainian military aircraft had been shot down, albeit flying at lower altitude. It does come as a bit of a surprise that the Ukrainian state aviation authorities gave the go-ahead and the all-clear to fly at 32,000 feet through that zone. However, any thoughts of that kind have to be balanced against the fact that the aviation industry does need enough flexibility to operate, and fuel cost considerations may come into play when it comes to planning flight routes, especially long-haul flight routes.
Let's look from aircraft to airports. They've often been the focus, I think, of recent bids to destabilise situations, to actually, attack infrastructure, that sort of thing. Where is the sort of the status presently, if you like? Is there a kind of a pretty solid collective international awareness about the risks that are faced on a day-to-day basis?
I think it's growing, but I do believe that people are more worried about the threats to an actual aircraft than the threats to the infrastructure on the ground. And perhaps more attention needs to be paid to protecting the physical infrastructure of an airport, as a number of recent incidents illustrate. The fact of the matter is there have been a number of attacks over recent weeks on airports in unstable areas of the world, such as Pakistan and Afghanistan, as well as targeting of Ben Gurion airports in Tel Aviv by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It all underlines the fact that airport security officials and agencies, they really need to look at the ground as well as the air when it comes to protecting aviation.
Well, let's look at that in a bit more detail then, because we're talking, again, with the advantage of hindsight, as you mentioned, about MH17 and this regulation of airspace. When it comes to airports, again, is the picture rather too fragmented in your view? Is there a risk that you've got the airport operators, you've got local security, there's then law enforcement, military? Is it potentially a case of having too many cooks? Or do you think that there is a bit more knowledge now that it needs to be streamlined, it needs to be made a little more efficient, for want of a better word?
This is a question that's perplexed the aviation industry for many years, and there have been a number of efforts and conferences and symposiums and so forth to try and get a common way forward. But I suppose even that comes with its own risks, because if there is a one-size-fits-all approach to airports, be they major hubs or regional airports, if there is a one-size-fits-all method of securing them, then it becomes perhaps easier for terrorists or other people who want to attack an airport to plan their attacks, because they know that protection is being organised in a certain way. So there does have to be an element of unpredictability and difference. And of course, local conditions as well will dictate how security is carried out.
So just a final thought on that then. Do you think, are you pretty confident, know the industry so well, that it will retain that sort of flexibility, I guess, to be able to be reactive rather than proactive necessarily? Are you confident that, all that could and should be being done is indeed being done?
I think as much as feasibly possible, the aviation industry and security officials, I'll be the first to admit, they can do more, but a lot depends on other considerations, be they political or financial, as to how much they can do at a given airport. But I think more is being done, more attention is being paid to the issue. However, more does need to be thought as to the overall global strategy.
Could be another couple of symposiums on the way before we get anywhere. Ben Vogel of IHS Janes Airport Review, thanks very much indeed for joining us here on